Emily Walker sat at her desk in the Westport, Connecticut office of the advertising firm Bright Ideas. She was 25 and a graphic designer. Her fingers raced across a graphics tablet, finishing a logo for a local coffee shop. Emily loved her job, creating something beautiful, seeing her ideas come to life on the screen. But today she was distracted. Every 5 minutes she glanced at the ring on her left hand. A thin silver band with a small diamond glittered in the lamplight. Last night, Daniel Clark, her boyfriend, had proposed to her. Emily smiled, remembering that moment. They were walking in Winslow Park, where trees surrounded a small lake. It was 6 in the evening, and the sun was setting, turning the sky orange. Daniel stopped at a wooden bench, turned to her, and took her hands. He was wearing his usual clothes, jeans, a gray t-shirt, and sneakers. His brown hair was slightly tousled by the wind. He looked serious, but his eyes were bright. "Emily, I want to spend the rest of my life with you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Will you marry me?" He pulled out the ring box and dropped to one knee. Emily froze, her heart pounding. She nodded, speechless, and then threw her arms around his neck. "Yes, yes, of course," she finally cried out. They laughed and hugged, and Emily felt happier than she had ever felt in her life. Now, sitting in her office, she twisted the ring on her finger. Happiness mixed with anxiety. Tonight, she and Daniel were supposed to tell her parents, Margaret and Richard Walker, about their engagement. Emily knew they wouldn't be happy. Her parents owned a chain of furniture stores in Connecticut and lived in a big house on a hill. They had always wanted Emily, a husband with money, status, and a respectable career. Daniel, a software engineer who worked remotely, didn't fit their expectations. Emily looked at her watch. It was noon. She texted Daniel, "Are you ready for tonight? I'm already nervous." He texted back a minute later, "It'll be okay. I'm here with you." Emily smiled. Daniel always had a way of calming her down. She returned to work, but her thoughts were swirling around her parents. Margaret, her mother, was a strict woman of 50, with a perfect hairdo and expensive dresses. She liked to control everything, from the business to her daughter's life. Richard, her father, was calmer, but supported his wife in everything. They often talked about Trevor Hayes, Emily's ex-boyfriend. Trevor was the son of their friends, now a lawyer in New York. His parents thought he was perfect. Emily broke up with him 3 years ago, but Margaret still mentioned him at every opportunity. Emily sighed and opened an old project to distract herself. She remembered how she had met Daniel. It happened 2 years ago at a charity event in Westport. Emily had helped organize the event for a local animal shelter. She was standing at a table with drinks when a tall guy in jeans walked up and asked, "Is that lemonade or something stronger?" His smile was warm and his eyes were kind. They started talking, and Emily learned that Daniel was a programmer who had moved to Westport from Boston. He was working on a project, but wouldn't go into detail. By the end of the night, he asked for her number. They had been together ever since. Daniel was different from Trevor. Trevor loved expensive restaurants, loud parties, always talking about his career. Daniel was different. He preferred quiet evenings at home, cooking pasta with a sauce he made himself, and listening to Emily when she talked about her work. When Emily doubted her designs, he would sit next to her and say, "You're talented. Just keep going." It gave her strength. Emily finished work at 5 o'clock. She packed her bag, said goodbye to her coworkers, and went outside. The October air was cool, and the leaves crunched under her feet. Daniel was waiting for her by the car, an old blue sedan. He was wearing a dark green jacket, his hands in his pockets. When he saw her, he smiled. "Ready?" he asked, opening the door for her. Emily nodded, but her stomach clenched. "I just want them to accept you," she said as she got into the car. Daniel got behind the wheel and took her hand. "We'll get through this. The main thing is that we're together." They drove to Emily's house to change. She lived in a small apartment in downtown Westport. Her sketches were framed in the living room, and on the couch was a throw blanket that she and Daniel had bought together. Emily chose a blue dress and low-heeled shoes. Daniel wore a dark gray shirt and slacks. He looked smart but casual, not like Trevor, who always wore $1,000 suits. "You look good," Emily said, adjusting his collar. "You too," he replied and kissed her forehead. They got into the car and drove to their parents' house. The drive took 20 minutes. Emily looked out the window, where houses and trees flashed by. She remembered how, as a child, her parents took her to music lessons, tennis lessons, drawing lessons. They wanted her to be the best at everything. When she chose design instead of business, Margaret said, "This is not a profession for a serious girl." Emily still remembered those words. They pulled up to the house, a large one with white walls and a red roof. There were two cars in the yard, her father's Mercedes and her mother's Lexus. Emily took a deep breath. Daniel parked and turned to face her. "If it gets hard, just squeeze my hand, okay?" he said. Emily nodded. They got out of the car and headed for the door. The house was neatly decorated, potted flowers at the entrance, lanterns along the path. Emily raised her hand to knock, but froze. Her heart was beating so loudly she was afraid Daniel would hear. "Emily," he called quietly. She looked at him. His face was calm, but his eyes were supportive. Emily squeezed his hand and knocked on the door. A second later, footsteps were heard, and Margaret opened the door. She was wearing a beige dress, her hair done up as always. She smiled, but her gaze slid to Daniel, and her smile grew colder. "Emily, dear, come in," she said, stepping aside. Emily stepped inside, still holding Daniel's hand. The living room was spacious. Leather sofas, a glass table, paintings on the walls. Richard was sitting in a chair with a newspaper. He stood up when he saw them. "Hello, Mr. Walker," Daniel said, extending his hand. Richard shook it, but his face remained neutral. "It's good to see you, Daniel," he replied, though his tone was formal. "Dinner's almost ready," Margaret said. "Emily, will you help me in the kitchen?" Emily didn't want to leave Daniel, but she nodded. She let go of his hand and followed her mother. The kitchen smelled of roasting meat and herbs. Margaret was chopping vegetables. "So, what's the occasion?" she asked, not looking at Emily. "You said you had news." Emily swallowed. "Mom, let's wait until dinner. We want to tell you together." Margaret looked at her. "This is serious, isn't it? I hope you've thought about it. You're pregnant." Emily didn't answer. She picked up a plate and began setting the table. Half an hour later, they sat down to dinner. The table was set perfectly, white tablecloth, china, silverware. Richard sat at the head, Margaret opposite. Emily and Daniel were next to each other. "So," Richard began, cutting off a piece of meat. "What's the news?" Emily looked at Daniel. He nodded, giving her the floor. She took a deep breath. "Mom, Dad, Daniel proposed to me. We're going to get married." Silence fell over the room. Margaret put down her fork. Richard froze, holding his glass of wine. Emily felt her palms grow sweaty. "Mary?" Margaret asked, her voice level, but her eyes narrowed. "Yes," Daniel said. "I love Emily. I want us to be together." Richard cleared his throat. "That's unexpected. Daniel, tell me what you do. Remind me." Emily tensed. She knew her father would start asking questions. Daniel answered calmly, "I'm a software engineer. I work remotely on technology projects." "Remotely," Margaret repeated. "And is it stable, enough to support a family?" "Mom!" Emily exclaimed. "What?" Margaret looked at her. "That's a reasonable question. We want you to be safe." Daniel squeezed Emily's hand under the table. "I understand your concern. I'm working on a promising project. Emily and I will be fine." Richard nodded, but his look was skeptical. "We just want what's best for our daughter," he said. The dinner went on, but the atmosphere was heavy. Margaret asked about the wedding, but her questions sounded like an interrogation: where they would live, who would pay for the ceremony. Emily answered briefly, trying not to show how hurt she was. Daniel was silent, only occasionally supporting her. After dinner, Emily and Daniel said goodbye. Emily and Daniel walked out of their parents' house into the cold October night. The door closed behind them with a soft click, but Emily felt like it had hit her. Dinner had been over for only 5 minutes, and her chest was tight with resentment. She held Daniel's hand tightly as they walked toward his blue sedan, which was parked in the driveway. The streetlights illuminated the neat flower beds, but Emily ignored them. Her parents' words were running through her head. Stability, opportunity, Trevor. Daniel opened the car door for her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. Emily shook her head and sat down in the passenger seat. She stared straight ahead as Daniel walked around the car and got behind the wheel. As soon as he started the engine, tears began to stream down her cheeks. She wiped them with her sleeve, but they didn't stop. "Emily," Daniel touched her shoulder, "talk to me." "They're terrible," she managed, her voice shaking. "They didn't even try to accept you. All these questions about your job, about money, as if you were nobody." Daniel sighed and took her hand. His palm was warm, and it calmed Emily a little. "They're just worried about you," he said. "I'm not offended. They don't know me." Emily turned to him. His face was calm, his brown hair slightly disheveled, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "You don't have to put up with this," she said. "I wanted them to see how wonderful you are, and they mentioned Trevor." Daniel nodded but said nothing. He turned on the radio and soft music filled the car. They drove through the dark streets of Westport. Emily stared out the window at the houses and trees. Dinner had been a disaster. Her parents, Margaret and Richard, had greeted Daniel coldly. Richard had asked about his work, as if he were checking a resume. Margaret had implied that Emily deserved better, and then they brought up Trevor Hayes, her ex-boyfriend, a lawyer in New York. Emily hated it when they did that. "I don't want you to worry," Daniel said, interrupting her thoughts. "We love each other. That's more important than what they think." Emily squeezed his hand. "I know, but it hurts. They're my parents. I want them to be happy for us." Daniel looked at her. "Give them time. Maybe they'll get used to it." Emily wanted to believe him, but a lump grew in her chest. She remembered the way her mother had looked at Daniel when he told her he was working remotely. Margaret had raised an eyebrow, as if he'd admitted something shameful. Richard had asked how much he made, and Daniel had answered evasively, "Enough to keep Emily and me happy." Emily had supported him then, but now she was unsure. Why hadn't he told her more? She knew he was working on a project, but he'd never gone into detail. They pulled up to Emily's apartment. Daniel parked and turned to face her. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "I need to be alone. I'm sorry." He nodded and kissed her forehead. "Call me if you change your mind. I'm always here." Emily got out of the car and walked up to the apartment. She dropped her bag on the floor and collapsed on the couch. The living room was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. She looked at the ring on her finger. The diamond glittered in the lamplight. Emily remembered Daniel putting it on her finger in the park. She had been sure then that she had made the right choice. Now her confidence was fading. She picked up her phone and opened her messages. There was one from Sarah, her friend. "How was dinner? Are your parents excited?" Emily wrote, "Terrible. They hate Daniel." Sarah responded a minute later, "Oh, honey, hang in there. Want to meet up tomorrow?" Emily agreed and put the phone away. She went into the bedroom, changed into her pajamas, and climbed into bed. She couldn't sleep. Emily stared at the ceiling, replaying dinner in her head. Margaret had said, "Trevor always knew what he wanted. He wouldn't have made us worry." Richard had added, "We just want you to be safe." Emily had tried to defend Daniel, but their words had hit home. She remembered Trevor, his confident smile, his expensive suits, his plans for the future. They had broken up because he was too busy with himself, but his parents had seen him as perfect. Emily rolled over onto her side, pulling the covers up around her. She thought about Daniel. He was different. He cooked her dinner when she was tired from work. He listened when she talked about her designs, but he never talked about his work. Emily knew he was a software engineer, but she didn't know what he worked on. She'd once seen him answer a phone call from California, but he'd said, just coworkers. Emily hadn't pushed back then, but now it bothered her. What if her parents were right? What if he couldn't give her stability? She remembered the way Daniel had looked at her in the car. His words, "We love each other," had been sincere. But was that enough? Emily had grown up in a family where money and status were important. Her parents had built a business from scratch, and they expected her to choose someone equally successful. Daniel, in jeans and an old sedan, didn't fit into that picture. Emily sat up in bed and turned on the lamp. She picked up her laptop and opened the browser. She was curious. She typed Daniel Clark, programmer, into Google. Nothing specific came up. A few social media profiles, but none of his. She knew he avoided publicity. He'd once said, "I want to be loved for who I am, not for what I have." Emily had thought it was cute. Now she wondered if he was hiding something. She closed her laptop and lay back down. The room was dark, except for the streetlight shining through the curtains. Emily stared at the ring. It was simple, but it meant so much. Daniel had said he'd been saving for it for 6 months. It touched her, but Margaret's words echoed in her head. "You deserve more." Emily remembered a conversation with her mother in the kitchen while they were clearing away the dishes. Margaret had taken her hand and said, "Emily, think about it. You can choose someone who will give you everything." Emily had then replied, "I love Daniel." But Margaret had just shaken her head. Love fades. Bills remain. Emily clenched her fists. She hated that her parents made her doubt. She loved Daniel. He was kind, caring, always there for her. But what if love wasn't enough? What if she disappointed her parents and herself? She stood up and went to the window. Westport was asleep, the streets empty. Emily thought about Trevor. She hadn't seen him for 3 years, but her parents always reminded her of him. He had called her after the breakup, but she hadn't answered. Now she wondered if she had done the right thing. Trevor was ambitious, successful, but he had never looked at her the way Daniel did. Emily went back to bed and lay down, closing her eyes. She tried to imagine a future with Daniel, their wedding, their house, their children. But every time she did, her parents' faces appeared in her mind, their disapproval. She knew they wouldn't give in. They would keep pushing until she changed her mind. Emily opened her eyes and looked at the ring again. It was a symbol of their love, but now it felt heavy. She took it off and put it on the nightstand. She had to think. Could she stand up to her family? Could she choose Daniel, despite everything? Emily sat on the couch in her apartment, leafing through a wedding magazine. Across from her, on the coffee table, lay the invitation samples she'd picked up from the printer. It was a Saturday in late October, and Emily and Daniel had begun planning their wedding. They wanted a small ceremony in Winslow Park with close friends and family, but Emily's parents had other plans. Emily glanced at her phone. 3 missed calls from Margaret, her mother. She knew what the conversation was going to be about. Daniel walked into the living room with 2 mugs of coffee. He was wearing jeans and a gray t-shirt, his hair slightly disheveled. He placed the mug in front of Emily and sat down next to her. "How's it going?" he asked, nodding at the magazine. Emily sighed. Slowly, "I want something simple, but Mom calls every day. She talks about a ballroom, an orchestra, a $10,000 dress." Daniel frowned. "We agreed we didn't want any of that. This is our day." "I know," Emily said, sipping her coffee, "but she doesn't listen. She sent a guest list for 200 people yesterday. I don't even know half of it." Daniel took her hand. "Tell her what we decided. If she doesn't like it, that's her problem. Of course, if you want, I can explain it to them myself, but that will only make their attitude towards me worse. I don't care, you're my family, not them. But my opinion is that you should set boundaries for them yourself." Emily nodded, but her chest was heavy. She had felt crushed since dinner with her parents 2 weeks ago. Margaret and Richard, her father, had made it clear that they did not approve of Daniel. Emily tried to argue, but their words stuck in her like splinters. She opened her laptop to check her email. There was an email from Margaret with photos of a banquet hall in downtown Westport. "Emily, this is the perfect place," she wrote. "I've already spoken to the manager. Just need a deposit." Emily closed her laptop and rubbed her temples. "Mom again?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Emily replied. "She wants us to book the hall for $20,000. She thinks you can't afford it." Daniel shrugged. "I can contribute my share. I have savings." Emily looked at him. "Are you sure? I don't want you to spend everything you have." He smiled. "Don't worry. We'll get through this." Emily wanted to ask how he could be so sure, but she kept quiet. Daniel rarely talked about his job. She knew he was a software engineer who worked remotely, but he didn't share details. Sometimes he spent nights on his laptop, answering calls from California. Emily thought he was just a hard worker, but after dinner with her parents, doubts began to gnaw at her. What if he made less than he needed to live the life her parents wanted? By midday, Emily called Margaret. "Mom, we don't want a ballroom," she said, trying to sound firm. "We're planning a park wedding." Margaret snorted. "In the park? Emily, you're not serious. What will our friends think? You need to look presentable. Trevor would never have a wedding in a field." Emily clutched her phone. "Mom, enough about Trevor. I'm marrying Daniel." "I just want you to think," Margaret said. "Trevor would give you the life we dreamed of. A home, travel, security. And what can Daniel do? He won't even tell you what he does." Emily ended the conversation by promising to think about it. She agreed to meet Margaret tomorrow to discuss the hall. It was easier than arguing. She hated herself for being weak, but she didn't want to fight. That evening, Emily and Daniel went to a party at Emily's friend Sarah's. Sarah lived in a house on the outskirts of Westport, and her living room was full of people. The music was loud, and there were snacks and drinks on the table. Emily had a glass of wine and was trying to relax. Daniel was talking to someone by the window, and Emily noticed him smiling. She loved his smile, warm, genuine. Emily was standing at the refreshment table when a woman in a red dress approached her. "You're Emily Walker, right?" she asked. Emily nodded. "Yes. Who are you?" "I'm Lindsay, Trevor Hayes's friend," the woman said. "We met a couple of years ago at his birthday party." Emily tensed. "Oh, right. Hi." Lindsay smiled. "I heard you were getting married. Congratulations. Trevor has been telling me about you. He still misses you." Emily squeezed her glass. "Miss you? We broke up 3 years ago." "I know," Lindsay said, "but he often talks about the two of you together. He says you were special." Emily didn't know what to say. She mumbled, "Thank you," and walked away to Sarah. Lindsay's words kept running through her head. Did Trevor miss her? She hadn't thought about him in months, but now the memories came back. Their dates at restaurants, their weekend getaways, his confidence. But he never asked her what she wanted. Sarah noticed her thoughtful look. "Hey, what's wrong?" she asked. Emily told Lindsay about the conversation. Sarah rolled her eyes. "Forget it. Trevor's just playing his game. He's always been selfish." Emily nodded, but Lindsay's words wouldn't let go. She looked at Daniel, who was laughing with his friends. He was so different, humble, caring. But was that enough? On Monday, Emily met Margaret at a cafe. They drank coffee, and Margaret showed them photographs of the banquet hall. "It's going to be beautiful," she said. "We can't let people think you're skimping." Emily nodded wearily. "Okay, Mom, but Daniel and I want our own thing." Margaret looked at her. "Emily, you deserve better. Trevor would give you the wedding people have been talking about for years." Emily squeezed her cup. "Mom, that's enough. I chose Daniel." Margaret sighed. "Okay, but come to dinner on Friday. We're having a family event. Some old friends will be there." Emily agreed to avoid an argument. She went home and told Daniel about the conversation. He shrugged. "If it's important to you, we'll go." Emily noticed that he had become quieter. "Are you okay?" she asked. Yes, he replied. Just a lot of work. Emily didn't know that Daniel was spending his nights in his apartment, working on a new project. His startup was developing a data management app, and a major Silicon Valley company had expressed interest. If the deal went through, it would be a breakthrough. But Daniel kept quiet. He wanted Emily to love him for who he was, not for his money. He saw the pressure his parents were putting on her, and he was afraid she would start to see him as just a wallet. On Friday, Emily and Daniel arrived at their parents' house. The living room was full of people, friends of their parents, neighbors, colleagues. Emily noticed Trevor by the fireplace. He was wearing a dark gray suit, holding a glass of whiskey. Her heart skipped a beat. Margaret came up to them, smiling. Emily, Daniel, it's good to see you. Look who's here. Trevor, our old friend. Trevor walked over, his smile confident. Emily, long time no see. Congratulations on your engagement. Emily forced a smile. Thank you. Daniel shook Trevor's hand. Pleased to meet you, he said, but his voice was even. Trevor looked at Emily. How are you? I heard you're planning a wedding. Yes, she replied. We're working on it. Margaret intervened. Trevor just got back from London. He's working on a big case. Isn't that impressive? Emily nodded, feeling the tension rise. Daniel stood nearby, but said nothing. She noticed the way his jaw clenched. Margaret and Richard had been keeping Trevor close all evening, introducing him to the guests. Emily tried to talk to Daniel, but he seemed distant. As they drove away, Emily asked, Are you mad about Trevor? Daniel shook his head. No, I just see how your parents are pressuring you, and you're not doing anything about it. It feels like you're second-guessing yourself. Emily wanted to object, but she kept silent. She knew he was right. Emily sat in her apartment, looking at her wedding to-do list. There were 2 weeks left, and her desk was covered in paperwork. Menus, seating plans, a florist contract. The wedding would be in a ballroom, as Margaret, her mother, had wanted, though Emily had dreamed of a park. She picked up her phone and opened her messages. There was one from Trevor Hayes, her ex. Congrats on the planning. I'm in Westport for the weekend if you need anything. Emily didn't respond. He had been texting her more often since she'd agreed to invite him to the wedding under pressure from her mother. Each message made her heart clench. Emily put her phone down and rubbed her temples. She loved Daniel Clark, her fiancé, but the last few weeks had been like navigating a minefield. Her parents, Margaret and Richard, kept reminding her that Daniel wasn't the one for her. They compared him to Trevor, a New York lawyer who they said could give her a decent life. Emily defended Daniel, but their words and Trevor's presence in her life at a family event, on a video call, in text messages were sowing doubt. She felt the panic growing with each passing day. Daniel walked into the living room with his laptop. He was wearing jeans and a gray t-shirt, his hair disheveled. I ordered the cake you wanted, he said, sitting down next to her. Vanilla with cream. Emily smiled, but it was weak. Thank you, you're doing great. He noticed her tension. Hey, are you okay? You're kind of quiet. Emily shrugged. Just stress, wedding, parents, everything. Daniel took her hand. We'll get through this. The main thing is that we're together. She nodded, but her chest was heavy. She wanted to tell him about her doubts, about Trevor, but she was afraid of his reaction. Daniel had seemed distant lately, often working late. She knew he was busy with a project, but he wouldn't share details, and that made her even more anxious. That evening, Emily went to a bachelorette party thrown by her friend Sarah. The party was at a bar in downtown Westport. The tables were decorated with garlands, and Emily wore a sash that said bride. Sarah, Lindsay, and 5 other friends drank cocktails and laughed. Emily tried to have fun, but her thoughts were racing. After her second glass of wine, Sarah made a toast. To Emily and her happy life with Daniel, she said. Everyone drank, but Lindsay, Trevor's friend, looked at Emily. Are you sure you're ready? Weddings are serious. Emily frowned. Of course I'm sure. Lindsay shrugged. Trevor was just telling me how happy you were. He said you were planning a future together. Emily clutched her glass. That was 3 years ago. I'm with Daniel now. Sarah rolled her eyes. Lindsay, that's enough. Emily made her choice. But the conversation continued. One of the friends, Kate, said, I remember Trevor taking you to New York for the weekend. You went to this fancy restaurant. He was so confident. Emily nodded, but the memories came flooding back. Trevor had been charming, taking her to fancy places, talking about the big apartment he was going to buy. But he rarely asked her what she wanted. Daniel had been different. He cooked her dinner, listened to her ideas about design. But he didn't talk about the future the way Trevor did. Emily couldn't help but compare them, and it scared her. The party ended around midnight. Emily returned home feeling drained. She went to bed, but couldn't sleep. She thought about Lindsay's words, about Trevor, about her parents. Margaret had called the day before and said, Emily, you can still make up for this. Trevor is going to the wedding. Talk to him. Emily waved her hand, but the words stuck in her head. Meanwhile, Daniel was in his apartment, preparing for a meeting with his business partner, Matt. They were working on a startup building a data management app. Daniel had been investing 2 years in it, and the company had recently received an offer from Silicon Valley investors for $5 million. It was a breakthrough that could make him rich. Matt had come over with a bottle of beer to celebrate. You're a genius, Matt said, opening the bottle. This deal will change everything. When are you going to tell Emily? Daniel shook his head. After the wedding. I want her to marry me, not my money. Matt frowned. Dude, she needs to know. This is a huge part of your life. Daniel shrugged. I know, but I've seen the way her parents look at me. They want someone like Trevor, with an apartment in Manhattan. I don't want Emily to think I'm trying to outdo them. Matt nodded, but looked skeptical. They discussed the details of the deal, and Matt left. Daniel sat at his laptop, reviewing the documents. He noticed that Emily had become distant. She laughed less, talked less about the wedding. He chalked it up to stress, but deep down he knew something was wrong. Her decision to invite Trevor to the wedding, which she had told him about a week ago, had hurt him. He had asked, Are you sure this is right for us? She said it was no problem, but her voice was unsure. The next day, Emily went to her parents. They were sitting in the living room with photographs of the banquet hall on the table. Margaret was leafing through the album. Emily, everything is almost ready. But think again. Are you sure about Daniel? Emily clenched her fists. Mom, I'm tired of talking about this. I love him. Richard, sitting in the chair, looked at her. We're not against love, but look at Trevor. He called us yesterday, said he was glad to be at the wedding. He wants the best for you. Emily felt panic rise in her throat. Dad, stop. I made a choice. Margaret sighed. We just want you to be happy. If you make a mistake, it will be too late. Emily left feeling crushed. When she got home, she opened her laptop and looked at old photos. One was of her and Trevor on the beach 3 years ago. They were smiling, but Emily remembered how he'd brushed her off when she wanted to talk about her work. Then she opened a photo of Daniel sitting in the park, his arm around her. She knew she loved him, but the fear of disappointing her parents was suffocating her. That evening, Daniel came to her with pizza. They ate sitting on the couch, but Emily was quiet. He asked, Are you nervous about the wedding? She nodded. Yes, it's all too fast. He took her hand. We can slow down if you want. Emily shook her head. No, I want this. It's just parents. Daniel nodded, but his eyes were hard. He saw how distant she was, but he didn't know how to fix it. He decided he would tell her about the startup after they got married to start their life afresh. He didn't want the money to change her feelings. The next day, Emily went to try on her wedding dress. The salon was bright, with large mirrors. The dress was white, with a long train chosen by Margaret. Emily put it on and looked in the mirror. The dress fit perfectly, but she felt like an outsider. Sarah, standing next to her, said, "You look amazing." Emily nodded, but her hands were shaking. Emily stood before the mirror in the bridal room of the Westport ballroom. Her wedding dress, white with a long train, clung to her figure. Her hair was in soft curls, her veil falling over her shoulders. Today, mid-April, was her wedding day to Daniel Clark. Emily looked at her reflection, but her hands were shaking. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. The last 2 weeks had been full of panic. Sarah, her friend, walked into the room holding a bouquet of white roses. "Emily, are you ready? You look amazing." Emily forced a smile. "Thanks. I'm just nervous." Sarah hugged her. "It's okay. Everything will be perfect. Daniel is waiting for you." Emily nodded, but her chest felt tight. She remembered the girls' night out, where her friends had talked about Trevor, and Margaret had said, "You can still make it right." Emily pushed those thoughts away. She had chosen Daniel. He was kind, caring, and supportive. Today was their day. Margaret walked in, wearing a blue dress and with her hair perfectly done. "Emily, it's time. The guests have arrived." Emily took the bouquet and followed her mother. The hall was luxurious, as Margaret wanted. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, flower arches. About 150 guests were sitting at tables, an orchestra playing a soft melody. Emily stopped at the entrance, her heart pounding. She looked at the altar where Daniel stood. He was wearing a black tuxedo, his hair neatly combed. His face seemed calm, but his eyes betrayed anxiety. Emily knew that he felt pressure from his parents, especially after she agreed to invite Trevor to the wedding. Richard, her father, came over and took her arm. "Are you ready, honey?" he asked. Emily nodded. The music changed to the wedding march, and they walked down the aisle. The guests turned, smiling. Emily tried to look at Daniel, but her gaze slid over the crowd. She spotted Trevor in the third row, wearing a dark gray suit. His blonde hair glistened under the chandeliers, and he looked at her with a small smile. Emily felt her heart skip a beat. She quickly looked away and smiled at Daniel. He looked at her, but his smile was strained. They reached the altar. Richard passed her hand to Daniel and sat down. Emily stood opposite the groom, her palms sweaty. The priest began the ceremony, speaking of love and commitment. Emily listened, her mind racing. It was time for the vows. Emily turned to Daniel, trying to focus. He took her hands, his fingers cold. The priest nodded to him, but Daniel suddenly raised his hand. "Just a minute," he said, his voice firm. He picked up the microphone from the stand next to the altar. The guests fell silent, all eyes on him. Emily frowned, her heart pounding. "Daniel, what are you doing?" she whispered. He looked out at the crowd. "Thank you to everyone who came today. This is an important day, and I appreciate your support." His voice was even, but Emily could hear the tension. He turned to her, his eyes full of pain. "Emily, I love you, but you didn't choose me. You chose your parents and your past, not our future." Emily froze, her breath caught. "Daniel, what?" she began, but he continued. "I'm sorry, I thought and hoped until the last moment that you wouldn't invite your ex to our day, but he's here, which means it's time for me to go," he said, looking into her eyes. "It's time for me to go." He placed the microphone on the altar, turned and walked toward the exit. The room filled with whispers. Emily stood there, unable to move. Her legs buckled, and Sarah ran to her side and supported her. "Emily, breathe," she said. The guests looked at each other, some stood up, some whispered. Margaret and Richard rose from their seats. Margaret ran to Emily, her face pale. "Darling, calm down. Everything will be fine," she said, but her voice was shaking. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He's gone," she whispered. "He's gone." Richard came over, his face stern. "It's his choice, Emily. It's not your fault." But Emily felt guilty. She looked at the crowd and saw Trevor walking towards her. He was calm, his eyes were sympathetic. "Emily," he said, "stopping next to you. I'm sorry about this. If you need to talk, I'm here. Emily recoiled. No, she said, her voice sharp. Leave me. Sarah took her hand. Come on, you need to sit down. They walked to a side room. Emily slumped into a chair, her dress crumpled. She covered her face with her hands, tears streaming uncontrollably. She felt like the world was crumbling. Margaret walked into the room, holding a glass of water. Emily, drink this. You need to calm down. Emily shook her head. Why couldn't you accept him? She said, her voice shaking. It's because of you. Margaret frowned. We wanted what was best for you. He left on his own. That's his weakness. Emily stood up, her hands clenched into fists. No, it was you. You and Trevor. You made me doubt. She walked out of the room, ignoring the guests who were looking at her. Sarah caught up with her. Emily, where are you going? I need air, Emily said. She went outside where it was cool. The evening sky was clear, the stars were bright. Emily leaned against the wall, her chest aching. She had lost something important, and it was her fault. Meanwhile, Daniel walked to his car, parked behind the hall. His tuxedo was unbuttoned, his tie dangling. He got behind the wheel and closed his eyes. His heart was pounding. He knew his words had hurt Emily, but he couldn't stay. Her hesitation, her agreement to invite Trevor, the pressure from his parents, all of it was suffocating him. He wanted to give her everything, love, a home, a future. But she hadn't chosen him, and he wasn't going to take second place in his own marriage. Daniel pulled a ring out of his pocket, his wedding ring, the one he was supposed to wear when they exchanged vows. It was simple, silver like hers. He looked at it, his fingers shaking. He remembered how they had laughed in the park, how they planned a life together. Now it seemed far away. He started the car and drove off. Westport was disappearing in the rearview mirror. Daniel knew he wouldn't be coming back. He clutched the ring in his hand and whispered, I'm sorry, Emily. Emily sat on the couch in her Westport apartment, clutching her phone. It had been 3 days since Daniel Clark had walked out on their wedding, leaving her at the altar. His words, "You didn't choose me," echoed in her head. She'd sent him dozens of texts and called him every hour, but he hadn't answered. The screen was blank, just her own words. Daniel, please talk to me. I'll explain. Emily felt the desperation in her chest. She'd lost him, and it was her fault. The apartment was quiet, but there were reminders of the wedding everywhere. A box of invitations on the table, a ribbon with the words "bride" on the chair. Emily got up and put them in the closet, but it didn't help. She blamed herself for agreeing to invite Trevor Hayes, her ex, to the wedding. She blamed her parents, Margaret and Richard, for pressuring her and comparing Daniel to Trevor. She even blamed Trevor for showing up and looking at her with sympathy when everything fell apart. The doorbell rang. Emily opened it and saw Margaret, wearing a beige coat and carrying a bag. "Emily, I brought you food," she said as she came in. "You're not eating, I know." Emily shrugged. "I'm not hungry." Margaret placed the containers on the kitchen table. "You have to take care of yourself. What happened wasn't the end of the world. You avoided a mistake." Emily clenched her fists. "Mistakes? Mom, Daniel wasn't a mistake. I loved him." Margaret sighed. "We wanted the best for you. Trevor is still here. He called yesterday, asking how you were." Emily shook her head. "I don't want to talk about Trevor." But Margaret continued. "He's successful, stable. He can give you what Daniel couldn't. Think about it." Emily turned away, tears welling up. She didn't want to listen, but her parents wouldn't give up. Richard came later and said, "Emily, Daniel has shown weakness. Trevor is a chance to start over." Their words were like salt in the wound. The next day, Trevor texted her, "Emily, I'm sorry about this. Let's meet up and talk." Emily wanted to ignore him, but she felt crushed. She agreed to a date, thinking it would distract her. They met at a cafe in the center of Westport. Trevor was wearing a navy blazer, his smile confident. He ordered coffee and started talking about his work, about his trip to London. Emily nodded, but didn't listen. She looked at his hands, at his expensive watch, and thought about Daniel. He would order her a latte and ask how her day was. With Trevor, she felt empty. "Emily, are you okay?" Trevor asked, interrupting her thoughts. She shook her head. "No, it's hard for me." He took her hand. "I understand, but I'm here. We can try again." Emily pulled her hand away. "Trevor, I'm not ready. I'm sorry." She walked away feeling even worse. The date had only reminded her of what she'd lost. Meanwhile, Daniel was at LaGuardia Airport in New York with a suitcase and a laptop. He had decided to move to California to focus on his startup. His company had received $5 million in funding, and now he could scale the project. But it was not a joy. He thought about Emily, about her face when he walked down the aisle. He knew he had hurt her, but he saw no other way out. Her doubts, Trevor's invitation, the pressure from his parents, all of this showed that she had not chosen him completely. Before leaving, Daniel met with a realtor in Westport. He was selling the house he had secretly bought to give to Emily when they married. It was a small cottage with a garden, the kind she had dreamed of. The realtor handed him a check, and Daniel signed the papers. "Are you sure?" the realtor asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes, I'm not coming back." On the plane, he looked out the window, where clouds obscured the sky. He pulled out the engagement ring he hadn't worn at the wedding. It was plain and silver. He clutched it in his hand and whispered, "Never look back." He vowed to move forward, to leave Emily and Westport behind. Emily returned to work at the advertising firm Bright Ideas a week after the wedding. She sat at her desk, drawing a logo for a client, but her fingers were stiff. Her coworkers were wary, no one mentioned the wedding, but Emily felt their eyes on her. She opened a drawer to get a pencil and saw an old photo of Daniel. They were standing in a park, his arm around her, both laughing. Emily closed the drawer, but her heart sank. At home, she tried to keep herself busy. She cleaned, cooked, watched TV shows, but every corner of the apartment reminded her of Daniel. His mug stood in the closet, his sweater lay in the laundry basket. Emily tried to return to normal life, but every day was a shadow of the past. She wrote to Sarah, "I don't know how to go on." Sarah replied, "Give yourself time. You are stronger than you think." But Emily didn't feel empowered. She felt guilty. She remembered Daniel asking, "Are you sure this is right for us?" when she decided to invite Trevor. She told him it was no problem, but now she knew how much it had hurt him. She'd let her parents and Trevor eclipse their love. Margaret kept calling, insisting that Trevor was the best choice. "He wants to see her again," she said one day. "Give him a chance." Emily refused, but the pressure continued. Trevor sent flowers with a note. "I'm waiting for you to be ready." Emily threw them in the trash. One evening, Emily decided to clear out her bedroom. She opened a drawer in her dresser where she kept old letters and cards. Among them was a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it and recognized Daniel's handwriting. It was a note he had left her a year ago, after their first anniversary. "Emily, I promise to be with you forever. You are my home. Love, Daniel." Emily froze, her eyes filling with tears. She clutched the note, feeling her chest breaking. She remembered him leaving it on the kitchen table, how she had laughed when she read it. Now it was a promise she couldn't keep. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she fell back onto the bed, clutching the note to her chest. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she whispered. In California, Daniel rented an apartment in San Francisco. His days were filled with work, meetings with investors, developing an app, hiring a team. He got up at 6 in the morning and went to bed after midnight. Work helped numb the pain, but at night he thought about Emily. He knew he had made the right choice by leaving, but that didn't make it any easier. He vowed never to come back, never to write, never to call. He wanted a new life without a past. Emily lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Daniel's note was on her pillow. She knew she had to move on, but she didn't know how. She had lost the love of her life, and every day was a reminder. She closed her eyes. but the tears kept flowing. Emily Walker sat in a restaurant in downtown Westport, across from Trevor Hayes. There were plates of pasta and glasses of wine on the table. Trevor, wearing a dark gray suit jacket, was talking about his latest case in New York. His voice was confident, his eyes glittering. Emily nodded, but she wasn't listening. It had been a year since Daniel Clark had walked out on their wedding, and now she was dating Trevor. Their relationship had begun 5 months ago, under pressure from her parents, Margaret and Richard, who saw Trevor as the perfect husband. But Emily felt empty. "Emily, can you hear me?" Trevor asked, sipping his wine. She winced. "Yes, I'm sorry. What did you say?" He smiled. "I was saying we could go to Miami for the weekend. I have a client there, but there will be time for the beach." Emily nodded. "Sounds good." But she didn't care. With Trevor, everything was predictable. Expensive restaurants, business trips, talk about his career. He was attentive, he brought flowers, but Emily didn't feel the spark. She compared him to Daniel, who cooked her dinner and listened to her talk about her work. These thoughts came unbidden, and Emily felt guilty every time. She went back to work at the advertising firm Bright Ideas, but the design no longer brought her joy. Emily sat at her desk, drawing logos, but her mind was elsewhere. She remembered the wedding, Daniel's words, "You didn't choose me." She tried to contact him after, but he had disappeared. His number was not answering, his social media profiles were empty. Emily knew it was her fault, her doubts, Trevor's invitation, her parents' pressure. Margaret and Richard were happy with her relationship with Trevor. At family dinners, Margaret would say, "Trevor is stable, Emily. You made the right choice." Richard would add, "He knows how to take care of the future." But Emily felt like a puppet being manipulated. She agreed with her parents, went on dates with Trevor, but inside there was emptiness. She smiled, but it was a mask. One evening, Emily stopped by a cafe after work. She grabbed a latte and sat by the window, scrolling through the news on her phone. Her eyes fell on a headline: "San Francisco startup raises $20 million." She opened the article and froze. It was a photo of Daniel in a shirt, standing in an office overlooking the bay. The article was about his company, which was building a data management app. Daniel Clark, 28, turned an idea into a Silicon Valley sensation, the text read. Emily felt her heart clench. This was the first time she'd learned that Daniel was rich. He'd never talked about his startup, always been modest. Now she understood why he'd kept quiet. He'd wanted her to love him, not his money. But she'd let him down. She'd let her parents and Trevor overshadow their love. Emily closed the article, her eyes filling with tears. She blamed herself more than ever. Meanwhile, Daniel lived in San Francisco, in a new apartment overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. His startup was a sensation, and he worked 14 hours a day. He bought a house in the suburbs, a modern one with a large window in the living room, but he rarely lived there, preferring the office. Daniel traveled: London, Tokyo, New York. Work filled his life, helping him forget the pain of his breakup with Emily. He avoided serious relationships, trusting no one after Emily chose her parents and Trevor. One day, he was invited to a party at a business partner's office. It was a spacious loft in the city center, with music and a crowd of about 100 people. Daniel was standing at the bar, holding a bottle of beer, when a woman approached him. She was short, with brown hair, wearing jeans and a white blouse. "You're Daniel Clark, right?" she asked, smiling. He nodded. "Yes. And who are you?" "Laura Davis," she replied. "Journalist. I write about startups. Your project is something. I want to interview you." Daniel shrugged. "Maybe, but not today." Laura laughed. "Okay, no job. Tell me, what do you do when you're not coding?" Her voice was warm, not forceful. They began to talk. Laura told him about her work, about the time she had been stuck in an elevator with a famous actor. Daniel smiled, for the first time in a year, genuinely. She was kind, ambitious, not like Emily, but her energy reminded him of what it felt like to be alive. The party ended late. Laura gave him her number. For an interview, she said with a wink. Or just for coffee? Daniel took the card, promising nothing. But as he drove home, he felt a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. Emily came home from the cafe. She turned on the light and sat down on the sofa. On the table lay a photo of Trevor, taken at his birthday party a month ago. They were standing next to each other. He was hugging her, both smiling. But Emily knew her smile was fake. She looked at the photo and realized that she didn't love him. Trevor was everything her parents wanted: successful, confident, rich. But he was not Daniel. He didn't ask about her dreams, didn't listen when she talked about design. Their relationship was empty, like a scene from someone else's life. Emily picked up her phone and opened the article about Daniel again. She looked at his photo. He looked older, more serious, but his eyes were just as kind. She remembered him leaving her notes, hugging her in the park. Now he was in California, building a new life, and she was stuck in Westport, living her parents' script. She wrote to Sarah, "I saw the article about Daniel. He's rich. I've ruined everything." Sarah wrote back, "Emily, you can't live in the past. Think about yourself." But Emily didn't know how. She felt like a puppet, with her parents and Trevor pulling at her strings. She wanted to break them, but she didn't know where to start. The next day, Emily went to her parents. They were sitting in the living room, Margaret leafing through a magazine, Richard reading a newspaper. "Trevor called," Margaret said. "He wants to invite you to New York." "That's a good sign." Emily clenched her fists. "Mom, I don't want to date him." Margaret frowned. "Emily, he's perfect. You can't grieve for Daniel forever." Emily stood up. "I'm not grieving. I'm trying to figure out what I want, not you." She left, ignoring her mother's objections. At home, she opened her laptop and began to draw, for the first time in months, with desire. It was a sketch of the park where Daniel proposed to her. She knew she couldn't take him back, but she wanted to take herself back. In San Francisco, Daniel sat in his office, looking out over the city. He thought about Laura, about her laugh. He wasn't ready for another relationship, but her business card was on his desk. Maybe coffee wouldn't be such a bad idea. He smiled, feeling like he was looking ahead for the first time in a year. Emily closed her laptop and picked up the photo of Trevor. She looked at it and realized that she didn't want this life. She didn't love him, and she never would. She put the photo in a drawer, deciding that it was time to make a change. Emily Walker sat at her desk in the New York offices of the advertising agency Creative Wave. She was 30 years old and worked as an art director, creating campaigns for major brands. Her desk was covered in sketches, and design awards hung on the wall. Emily had moved to New York 4 years ago, after breaking up with Trevor Hayes. Their relationship, which had begun under pressure from her parents, Margaret and Richard, had been empty and had ended after a year. Now she was building a new career, but the past was not letting go. Emily opened her laptop to finish a layout for a client, but her thoughts wandered to Daniel Clark. It had been 5 years since their failed wedding, when he had walked away from the altar saying, "You didn't choose me." Emily blamed herself for giving in to doubt, asking Trevor out, and not standing up to her parents. She tried to forget Daniel, but the memories kept coming back at the most unexpected moments. Walking down the streets of New York, she'd see couples holding hands and think of the park in Westport where he'd proposed. The thoughts hurt, but she couldn't stop them. Emily pulled the notebook she'd been jotting down notes for work from her bag. On the first page was an old sketch, a flower she'd drawn while sitting with Daniel at a cafe. She quickly closed the notebook, feeling her chest tighten. A year ago, she'd read an article about his startup becoming a Silicon Valley sensation. She'd realized then that he'd been hiding his wealth to be loved for himself. It had made her feel even more guilty, but Emily had tried to focus on her life. 3 years ago, she began going to therapy. Her therapist, Dr. Linda Cross, helped her sort out her mistakes. In her last session, Emily said, "I feel like I lost myself when I let my parents control me. I lost Daniel." Linda responded, "You can't get him back, but you can get yourself back." "What do you need to do to get him back?" Emily thought about it. She was learning to set boundaries with her parents, Margaret and Richard, who still called to ask why she was single. Emily kept her answers short, refusing to discuss her personal life. Emily returned to her Brooklyn apartment that evening. It was small, a couch, a table, shelves of books. On the wall hung her sketch of a cityscape drawn during her first year in New York. Emily turned on the kettle and sat at the table, looking out the window at the city. She thought about her life. Her career was on the rise, but she had avoided romantic relationships since Trevor. He was everything her parents wanted: successful, confident, rich. But he didn't ask about her dreams, and their relationship was like someone else's role. Now Emily wanted to find herself, but she didn't know where to start. She opened her laptop and started working on the project, but her thoughts wandered back to Daniel. She remembered him making her pasta, laughing at old movies. She knew he was probably living a new life, but she didn't check his social media for fear of pain. Emily closed her laptop and picked up her phone to text a friend, but decided against it. She felt alone, but that aloneness was her choice, a step toward independence. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Daniel Clark stood in the kitchen of his home. The house was modern, with large windows and a view of the hills. He had bought it 2 years ago, after marrying Laura Davis, a journalist he had met at a party 4 years earlier. Laura was in the living room, rocking their son, 2-year-old Jake, who was falling asleep with a stuffed animal in his arms. Daniel watched them, feeling warmth. Laura was kind, smart, and supportive. She had helped him open his heart after his breakup with Emily. Daniel became a famous entrepreneur. His company, creating a data management app, attracted millions in investment. Magazines described him as a tech leader. But he never talked about the past. Emily, Westport, the wedding, all were closed chapters. Laura knew he'd had a bad breakup, but she didn't ask questions. Daniel appreciated that and focused on the present. He walked over to Laura and picked up Jake. "Time for bed," he said, smiling. Laura nodded. "You're the best dad, but don't forget about the conference tomorrow." Daniel laughed. "I won't forget. You wrote my speech." He carried Jake to the nursery and put him to bed. When he returned, he hugged Laura. "Thank you for everything," he said. She kissed him, and Daniel felt he had found his place. His life was complete: family, work, home. He didn't think about Emily, but sometimes, in quiet moments, her image would flicker in his mind. He pushed those thoughts away, choosing the present. Emily went to Westport for the weekend to visit her parents. They were sitting in the living room, Margaret serving coffee. "Emily, you need to find someone," she said. "New York is full of opportunities." Emily clutched her cup. "Mom, I'm not looking. I'm working on myself." Richard, sitting in the chair, looked at her. "We're just worried. You can't be alone forever." Emily stood up. "I'm not alone. I'm living my life. It's time for you to accept that." She left feeling relieved. It was the second time she had stood up for herself. In therapy the following week, she told Linda about the visit. "I'm starting to say what I want," she said, "but I still blame myself for Daniel." Linda nodded. "Guilt is a way of keeping yourself stuck in the past. What can you do to let it go?" Emily thought about it. "I want to live for myself, not for my parents, not for the past. But that's scary." Linda suggested writing a letter to herself to express what she wanted to let go of. Emily began writing at home. "I was mad at myself for losing Daniel," she wrote, "but I can't change the past. I want to be free." The letter was a step forward, but the pain was still there. In San Francisco, Daniel was preparing to speak at a tech conference. Laura sat next to him, editing his slides. "You're going to be a star," she said. "Jake's already bragging about his dad at daycare." Daniel smiled. "He brags when I bring him cupcakes." They laughed, and Daniel felt grateful. His life was stable, full of love. He didn't want to change anything. Emily returned to New York and went to a park near her home. She sat on a bench, looking at people running and walking their dogs. She remembered Park in Westport, where Daniel proposed to her. The pain was sharp, But Emily was determined not to let it control her. She took out her notebook and wrote, "I can't bring back the past, but I can create the future. I choose myself." She closed her notebook and looked up at the sky. For the first time in 5 years, she felt determined. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she was willing to try. Emily stood up and walked home, ready for a new beginning. Emily Walker sat in her office at Creative Wave in New York City. She was 35 and a senior art director, overseeing projects for international brands. Her desk was covered with design awards, and her work adorned the walls: posters, logos, advertising banners. Emily had achieved success. Her name was known in the industry, but her personal life was empty. Since her breakup with Trevor Hayes 6 years ago, she had avoided serious relationships, afraid of making the wrong choice again. She had dated, but no one had lasted long. Emily wanted love, but the fear of making a mistake was stronger. She opened her laptop to check her client presentation, but her mind wandered to the past. 10 years ago, Daniel Clark walked out on their wedding, saying, "You didn't choose me." Emily still blamed herself for doubting him, for inviting Trevor, for the influence of her parents, Margaret and Richard. She had worked on it in therapy, learning to accept her mistakes, but the wound had never fully healed. Emily knew Daniel had become a successful entrepreneur. She had seen articles about his startup 5 years ago, but she hadn't looked for more news about him, afraid of the pain. Emily picked up her phone and pulled up an old photo of her and Daniel in a Westport park, laughing and hugging. She quickly closed the gallery, feeling a pang in her chest. Therapy had helped her understand how her parents' pressure had ruined her life. Margaret and Richard, now retired, were getting older, and Emily had begun to drift away from them. She visited them every 6 months, but the conversations were brief. They still asked why she wasn't married, but Emily no longer gave in. That evening, Emily returned to her Brooklyn apartment. She poured a glass of wine and sat on the couch, looking out the window at the city lights. She thought about her life. Her career was her pride, but she was lonely. She wrote in a notebook, as her therapist, Linda Cross, had advised. In her last session, Emily said, "I've accomplished a lot, but I feel like something is missing." Linda replied, "You've learned to live for yourself. Now ask yourself what you want next." Emily didn't know the answer, but she wanted to find it. Emily went to Westport for the weekend to visit her parents. They lived in the same house, but it seemed smaller than it had been when she was a child. Margaret, her hair turning gray, was preparing dinner. Richard, using a cane because of his bad knee, was sitting in the living room. "Emily, you look tired," Margaret said, setting down the plates. "You need more rest." Emily nodded. "It's busy, but I can handle it." Richard looked at her. "We're worried. You're 35. It's time to think about a family." Emily gripped her fork. "Dad, I'm living my life. Stop pushing me." Margaret sighed. "We just want you to be happy." Emily shook her head. "You wanted me to be who you wanted me to be. It ruined my life with Daniel." There was silence at the table. Margaret looked away. Richard cleared his throat. Emily had said it out loud for the first time, and the words freed her. She left after dinner, promising to come back in a month, but she knew she would be less frequent. The next day, Emily went for a walk around Westport. She passed familiar streets, shops, cafes. Her feet led her to Winslow Park, where Daniel had proposed to her. The bench was in the same place, by the lake. Emily sat down, feeling the memories rushing back. She remembered his smile, his words, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Tears stung her eyes, but Emily wiped them away. She realized that she couldn't live in the past. The park was part of her history, but not her future. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Daniel Clark played with his children in his front yard. He and Laura had 3 children: Jake, 7, Emma, 5, and Liam, 3. Their golden retriever, Max, chased a ball that Jake threw. Laura sat on the porch, holding a cup of coffee. "Daniel, you're going to ruin the dog," she said, laughing. "He's already eaten 2 balls." Daniel smiled. "Max deserves to have fun." His life was full. His company was thriving. With offices in 3 cities and hundreds of employees, Daniel became a mentor to young entrepreneurs, running workshops and investing in startups. Magazines called him a tech visionary, but he remained humble. Laura and the kids were his rock. They lived in the same house, with the big garden he'd once dreamed of with Emily. But Emily was a distant memory. He didn't talk about her, not even to Laura, who knew only that he'd had a breakup 10 years earlier. Daniel walked into the house where Laura was cooking dinner. "We need to get a new ball for Max," he said. "Jake already tore his." Laura rolled her eyes. "You're worse than children." They kissed, and Daniel felt grateful. His life was stable, happy, and he didn't want to change anything. Emily returned to New York on Monday. She was sitting in her office when a colleague, Mia, mentioned a tech conference in San Francisco. "There will be top speakers there," Mia said. "We can send someone from the agency. Do you want to go?" Emily thought about it. She knew San Francisco was Daniel's city, but the thought of the conference excited her. It was a chance to learn something new, to get out of her comfort zone. "Yes," she said. "I'll go." Mia smiled. "Cool. That'll be good for my career." Emily nodded, but her career wasn't on her mind. She wanted to start a new chapter, to leave the past behind. In therapy, she told Linda about the trip. "I'm scared," she admitted, "but I want to try." Linda nodded. "Fear is a sign that you're growing. What do you hope to find at the conference?" Emily shrugged. "Myself. New ideas. Inspiration, maybe." She began preparing for the trip, studying the conference program. Among the speakers, she saw a familiar name, Daniel Clark. Her heart sank, but she decided she wouldn't look for him. This was her trip, her chance. She wanted to focus on the future, not the past. In San Francisco, Daniel was preparing to speak at a conference. He was sitting in his office, checking his slides. Laura walked in, holding Liam. "Are you ready to hit the crowd?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "With your support, yes." She kissed him. "Jake and Emma want you to bring them some t-shirts from the conference." Daniel laughed. "Consider it done." His life was full. Family, work, friends. He didn't think about Emily, but sometimes, seeing a park or a bench, he would think of Westport. These moments were rare, and he quickly returned to the present. Emily returned home and opened her notebook. She wrote, "I'm going to San Francisco. This is my chance to start over. I don't know what I'll find, but I'm ready." She closed her notebook and looked out the window. New York City was sparkling with lights, and Emily felt hope. She knew the past would stay with her, but it wouldn't control her. The conference was a step forward, and she wanted to take it. Emily Walker stood in the lobby of the San Francisco Convention Center, clutching her attendee badge. She was 35, attending a tech conference on behalf of the agency Creative Wave, where she worked as an art director. The room was buzzing with hundreds of people, company booths, screens with presentations. Emily knew that Daniel Clark, her ex-fiancé, was the keynote speaker. He'd walked out on their wedding 10 years ago, and she'd only seen him in articles since then. Emily hadn't planned to look for him, but the thought of running into him made her heart beat faster. She walked to the main stage, where the talk was about to begin. The stage was brightly lit, the title flashing on the screen, "The Future of Tech." Emily sat in the fifth row, trying to concentrate. She held her breath when Daniel walked onto the stage. He was wearing a navy suit, his hair slightly grayer, but his eyes were just as kind. His wedding ring glittered on his left hand. He spoke confidently, talking about his startup, now a large company with offices all over the world. The audience applauded, and Emily felt her chest tighten. He looked happy, successful, a far cry from the Daniel who had asked her to marry him in a Westport park. After her presentation, Emily headed to the lobby, where the panelists were discussing their papers. She grabbed a coffee at the booth and was leafing through the program when she heard a voice behind her. "Emily?" She turned and froze. Daniel was standing 2 feet away, holding a bottle of water. His face was calm, but there was a flash of surprise in his eyes. Emily felt her cheeks heat up. Daniel, she said, trying to sound even. Hi. Good to see you, he said, smiling. How many years have passed? 10, she replied, swallowing. You look good. He nodded. Thanks. You too. Do you work in tech? Emily shook her head. No, I'm an art director. I came from the agency to look at trends. They fell silent, and Emily felt awkward. She saw his ring, his confidence, and it broke her heart. She wanted to leave, but the words came out of her mouth. Can we talk? Not here, somewhere else. Daniel looked at his watch. I have half an hour before my next meeting. Let's go to the cafe across the street. Emily nodded, and they walked out of the center. The cafe was small, with wooden tables and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. They sat by the window, ordering lattes. Emily looked at her hands, unsure where to begin. Daniel waited, his gaze calm but attentive. Daniel, she said finally, I have to say this. I regret what happened. About the wedding, about Trevor, about my parents. I made the wrong choice, and it ruined everything. Her voice shook, and her eyes filled with tears. She wiped them away, trying to keep her composure. Daniel looked at her, his face serious. Emily, he said quietly, I appreciate you saying that, but it's been 10 years. She clutched the cup. I know, but I had to tell you. I still think about you, about what could have been. Do we have a chance? Daniel sighed and leaned back in his chair. He paused, looking out the window at the people passing by. Then he turned to her. Emily, I'm grateful for our past. You were an important part of my life. But I've moved on. I have a wife, Laura. We have 3 children, Jake, Emma, and Liam. We have a dog, Max. My company is growing, and I mentor young people. My life is full, and I'm happy. Emily felt a pain shoot through her chest. She knew he was married, she'd seen the ring, but his words made it real. She nodded, trying not to cry. I'm happy for you, she said, her voice weak. I really am. He smiled, but it was soft, almost sympathetic. Thank you. I hold no grudge, Emily. We were young, we made mistakes, but the past is behind us. Emily swallowed, her fingers shaking. You're right. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Daniel nodded. I understand, and I wish you happiness. You are talented, always have been. Find your way. They finished their coffee, and Daniel looked at his watch. I have to go. Good luck at the conference. Emily forced a smile. Thank you. Good luck to you. He stood up, shook her hand, and walked out. Emily watched him until he disappeared around the corner. She felt tears running down her cheeks. She had lost him forever. His words about a wife, children, a dog were like a picture of the life she could have had. But she had chosen her parents, Trevor, doubt. Now he was a stranger happy, confident, with a new family. Emily remained in the cafe, staring at her empty cup. She remembered their wedding, him leaving, his words. You chose your past. She hadn't realized then how it would destroy her. Now, 10 years later, she saw clearly. She blamed herself, but Daniel's words, find your way, gave her a spark. She knew she had to let him go, let go of the guilt. She opened her bag and pulled out the notebook she kept for therapy. She wrote, I saw Daniel. He's happy, and it hurts. But he's right, the past is behind us. I want to find my future. Emily closed the notebook, feeling a mixture of pain and determination. She had lost him, but she wouldn't lose herself. Meanwhile, Daniel was back at the conference center. He was on his way to his next meeting, but his thoughts were on Emily. Her words had touched him, but he felt no regret. His life with Laura, the kids, Max was all he wanted. He remembered Emily as a young woman, laughing in the park, but it was like an old photo, warm but distant. He walked into the room, ready to speak, leaving the meeting behind. Emily returned to the convention center half an hour later. She walked to her agency's booth, where a colleague, Mia, was discussing a project. Emily, where have you been? Mia asked. I missed the panel. Emily smiled. Just needed some coffee. What did I miss? Mia started to tell her story, but Emily was only half listening. She was thinking about the conversation, about Daniel, about his life. It was painful, but she felt relieved. She had said what she wanted, and she had heard his answer. Now she could move on. That evening, Emily sat in her hotel room, looking out at the lights of San Francisco. She knew this trip had changed her. She hadn't been looking for Daniel, but fate had brought them together to close an old chapter. Emily opened her laptop and began looking for new projects for the agency. She wanted inspiration, new ideas, a new self. Daniel returned home late. Laura met him in the living room holding a cup of tea. "How was the conference?" she asked. He smiled. "Okay, tired, but it was cool." She hugged him. "Jake drew you a robot. He wants to show you." Daniel laughed. "I'll show him tomorrow." He kissed Laura, feeling at home. Meeting Emily had been unexpected, but it hadn't changed his life. He was where he wanted to be. Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about Daniel, about his words, about his new life. The pain was intense, but she knew it was the end. She had lost him forever, but it had set her free. She closed her eyes, ready for a new day, a new chapter. Emily Walker was sitting on a plane from San Francisco to New York. She was 35, and she was returning from a technology conference where she had met Daniel Clark, her ex-fiancé. Their conversation in a cafe, his words about his wife, children, and happy life, broke her heart. Emily looked out the window, where clouds covered the sky, and felt pain, but also a spark of determination. She had lost Daniel forever, but his words, "Find your way," touched her. Emily decided to use this pain as motivation to change her life. In New York, she returned to her Brooklyn apartment. It was Sunday, and the city was buzzing outside. Emily threw her bag on the couch and opened her laptop. She had been an art director at Creative Wave for 10 years, but in recent months she had felt stuck. Her projects were successful, but they weren't inspiring. Emily wanted to create something of her own, something that reflected her. She began looking for offices to rent, deciding to open her own design studio. The next day, Emily walked into her boss, Carol's, office. "I'm quitting," she said, holding up her resignation letter. "I want to start my own business." Carol was surprised. "Emily, you are one of the best. Are you sure?" Emily nodded. "Yes, I need something new." Carol shook her hand. "Good luck. If you change your mind, come back." Emily left the office feeling relieved. She found a small space in Brooklyn with big windows and exposed brick. A month later, she opened Studio Walker, focusing on projects that excited her: branding for local startups, design for charities. The work ignited a spark in her that hadn't been there in years. She hired 2 designers and began to build a reputation. Emily also decided to sort out her relationship with her parents, Margaret and Richard. They lived in Westport, and their pressure had once ruined her life with Daniel. She went to see them 2 weeks after her return. They were sitting in the living room, Margaret serving tea, Richard leafing through the newspaper. "Emily, you've lost weight," Margaret said. "Are you working too much?" Emily clutched her cup. "Mom, I opened my own studio. I'm happy, but I want to talk. You and Dad always made decisions for me. It ruined my life with Daniel." Margaret frowned. "We wanted the best for you." Emily shook her head. "You wanted me to be your best version. I forgive you, but I need boundaries. I'll visit, but don't let me dictate how I live my life." Richard looked at her. "You've changed, Emily." She nodded. "Yes, and I want you to accept it." Margaret was silent, but then she said, "We'll try." Emily left feeling like she'd taken a step forward. She was making peace with her parents, but for the first time she was standing up for herself. 3 months after the conference, Emily met Andrew Kane, a copywriter who was working with her studio on a project. He was 37, tall, with dark hair and a quiet smile. They started talking about work, then books, then life. Andrew asked her out for coffee, and Emily accepted, but she was wary. After Trevor and the pain of losing Daniel, she was afraid of intimacy. They met once a week, had coffee, and walked in the park. Andrew took his time, and that made Emily feel safe. One day, they were sitting in a cafe, and Andrew asked, "Emily, do you ever talk about your past?" She shrugged. "I don't like to look back. It was hard, but I'm learning to move on." He nodded. "I understand. If you want to talk, I'm here." Emily smiled. His words reminded her of Daniel, but Andrew was different, open, unobtrusive. She began to trust him, but she was in no hurry. She wanted to be sure that this was her choice, and not an attempt to fill a void. Emily continued to work with her therapist, Linda Cross. In the session, she talked about the studio, her parents, Andrew. "I'm learning to love myself," she said. "But sometimes I still blame myself for Daniel." Linda nodded. "You made mistakes, but they don't define you. You're building a new life. How do you feel when you look back on your steps?" Emily thought about it. "Pride and fear, but I want to keep going." She wrote in a notebook, as Linda had suggested. One night, she wrote, "I saw Daniel, and it broke me, but I don't want to live in guilt. I want to be me." That letter became her mantra. Emily learned to accept her mistakes, realizing that they made her stronger. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Daniel Clark returned home from the conference. His house was full of life. Jake, Emma, and Liam were playing in the living room, and Max, the golden retriever, was lying by the fireplace. Laura was cooking dinner, humming. Daniel walked in, hugged her from behind, and kissed her neck. "You're early," she said, smiling. "How was the conference?" "Okay," he replied, "but I'm glad to be home." He walked toward the kids, who rushed to him. Jake showed him a drawing of a robot. Emma told him about school. Liam tugged at his hand. Daniel sat on the floor, playing with them, and felt grateful. His company was thriving. He was mentoring dozens of entrepreneurs, but his family was his center. Meeting Emily at the conference had touched him, but it hadn't changed anything. He was happy with Laura, the kids, and Max. The past was behind him. Daniel and Laura put the children to bed and sat on the sofa. "You look thoughtful," she said. "Is everything okay?" He nodded. "Yeah, just appreciating what we have." Laura took his hand. "We are the lucky ones." Daniel kissed her, feeling like his life was complete. He didn't think about Emily, focusing on the present. Emily was working on a new project in her studio, branding for an environmental organization. She was drawing a logo, feeling inspired to return. Her team was growing, clients were praising her work. Emily knew she had made the right choice in leaving the agency. This was her life, her rules. She continued to date Andrew. One day they were walking around Brooklyn, and he told her about growing up in Chicago. Emily shared a story about drawing in school. They laughed, and Emily felt lighter. She didn't know where this relationship would lead, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to try. Emily returned to Westport a month later to check on her parents. Margaret and Richard were quieter than before. They asked about the studio, and Emily said enthusiastically, "We're proud of you," Richard said. Emily smiled, feeling their relationship changing. At home in New York, Emily stood in front of her bedroom mirror. She looked at her reflection, dark hair pulled back into a ponytail, eyes that were no longer empty. She remembered looking in the mirror 10 years ago before her wedding, whispering, "What am I doing?" Now she knew the answer. She was building the life she wanted. Emily smiled, for the first time in years, genuinely. It was a smile for herself, a smile for a woman who had learned to love herself. Emily Walker stood in her Brooklyn design studio, adjusting sketches on a whiteboard. She was 36, and Studio Walker was thriving. Within a year of opening, she had attracted big clients, startups, charities, local brands. The walls were covered with bright posters and logos created by her team of 5 designers. Emily found joy in the creativity and independence of managing projects that reflected her vision. She was no longer an art director at someone else's agency, but building her own business, and it energized her. That morning, Emily was teaching a workshop to three young designers she'd hired. They sat at a table, flipping through their portfolios. "Your work is unique," Emily said, looking at their sketches. "Don't be afraid to make mistakes. I doubted myself, but mistakes made me stronger." One of the designers, Ava, smiled sheepishly. "How did you stop being afraid?" she asked. Emily replied, "I started believing in myself. You can do it too." She saw herself in them 10 years ago, and she wanted to help them gain confidence. After the workshop, Emily returned to her desk. On the screen was a project for an environmental campaign she was working on with Andrew Kane, a copywriter she had been dating for 9 months. Their relationship had been slow, but for the first time, Emily felt like she was making choices with her heart, not fear. Andrew was easygoing, with a warm smile and a good listener. They spent their evenings walking around New York or working on projects. Emily trusted him, but she took her time, enjoying the process. She opened her phone and saw a text from Andrew. "Ready to meet a client today," came up with a tagline. Emily smiled and replied, "Cool, show me." His texts were succinct but precise, and their work together inspired her. Emily remembered how she had been afraid of dating again after Trevor Hayes and her breakup with Daniel Clark. Now she was learning to be open and not let the past define her. That evening, Emily decided to go to Westport, Connecticut, to visit her parents, Margaret and Richard. They were getting older and their health was failing. Margaret had heart problems. Richard walked with a cane. Emily wanted to mend the relationship, but on her own terms. She arrived at their house on Saturday. The living room was the same as it had been 10 years ago. Leather sofas, pictures on the walls. Margaret served tea. Richard sat in a chair. "Emily, you look good," Margaret said. "Your studio is on the news." Emily nodded. "Yes, we are growing, but I want to talk about something else. Your pressure ruined my life with Daniel. You made me doubt, and I lost him." Margaret put her cup down, her face tense. "We wanted the best for you." Emily clasped her hands. "I know, but you were wrong. You saw Trevor, the money, the status, but not me. I forgive you, but I need you to respect my choices." Richard cleared his throat. "We didn't mean to hurt you, Emily." Margaret looked away, her eyes moist. "We thought we were protecting you, but I see I was wrong. I'm sorry, dear." Emily felt relief. For the first time, her mother admitted her guilt. "Thank you," she said. "I want us to be a family, but as equals." They talked for another hour, and Emily left feeling liberated. She was no longer the 25-year-old girl trying to please her parents. She had chosen herself, and that was her victory. Back in New York, Emily continued working at the studio. She led projects that excited her: design for an animal shelter, branding for a women's initiative. Her team grew, and Emily became a mentor, leading workshops for students. She saw how her words inspired others, and it filled her with pride. The relationship with Andrew developed. They began spending weekends together, going to museums, cooking dinner at his apartment. One day, Andrew said, "Emily, you know I'm in no rush, but I'm glad you're in my life." She smiled. "Me too." For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the future. She chose Andrew not out of fear of loneliness, but because he made her happy. One evening, Emily turned on the TV while making dinner. The news was showing an awards ceremony in San Francisco. The announcer announced, "Daniel Clark is receiving an award for his contributions to technology." Emily froze, holding the knife. Daniel appeared on the screen, wearing a suit and smiling. He thanked his team and family and walked off stage. Emily looked at him and smiled. She was happy for him. 10 years ago, he walked out on their wedding, and she blamed herself. Now she saw that he had found happiness, and it didn't hurt. She let him go. Emily turned off the TV and sat down at the table. She thought about her life. The studio was thriving. She was helping young designers, building a relationship with Andrew. She was no longer someone who lived for her parents or the past. She was free. The following week, Emily and Andrew were discussing their holiday plans. They were sitting in a cafe, leafing through guidebooks. "What do you think of Italy?" Andrew asked. "Florence, Rome, wine." Emily smiled. "Sounds perfect. But I want to see the small towns where cheese is made." He laughed. "Deal. Cheese and wine." Emily looked at him, feeling warmth. She imagined their trip, strolling the streets, dining under the stars. For the first time, she wasn't afraid to dream. The future was open, and she wanted to see it. In San Francisco, Daniel returned home after the ceremony. Laura greeted him with a glass of wine. "My hero," she said, hugging him. "The kids are asleep, but Jake left you a note." Daniel found a drawing on the table, a robot with the words, "Dad is the best," written on it. He smiled, grateful. His life was full. Laura, Jake, Emma, Liam, Max. The company was thriving. He was mentoring young entrepreneurs, but his heart was in his family. He hadn't thought about Emily, but meeting her at the conference felt like closing an old chapter. Emily continued to work with her therapist, Linda Cross. In a session, she shared her visit to her parents, Andrew, and the news about Daniel. "I feel liberated," she said. "I'm not running from myself anymore." Linda nodded. "You've found your way. What next?" Emily thought. "I want to live, to love, to create, to be myself." She wrote in her notebook, as she had for years. This time she wrote, "I saw Daniel on the news. He is happy, and so am I. My life is mine. I am ready for Italy, for Andrew, for the future." Emily closed the notebook, feeling lighter. Back home, Emily began planning her trip with Andrew. She researched hotels in Florence, read about museums. Andrew sent her a photo of a vineyard with the caption, "Our first toast." Emily smiled as she imagined them together. She knew this was just the beginning. Emily Walker stood before a mirror in a small room in Brooklyn, adjusting her simple white dress. She was 37 years old, and today, in June 2026, she was marrying Andrew Kane. The ceremony had been small, in the garden of a friend's country home, with 30 close guests. Emily looked at her reflection and felt at peace. 11 years ago, she had stood in a luxurious hall, preparing for her wedding to Daniel Clark, but doubts and pressure from her parents had ruined everything. Now she was sure of her choice. Andrew, with his kindness and patience, had become her partner, and she loved him with all her heart. Emily's friend Sarah walked in with a bouquet of peonies. "Are you ready?" she asked, smiling. "Andrew is already nervous." Emily laughed. "Yeah, it's time." They walked out into the garden, where guests were seated on wooden chairs decorated with ribbons. Andrew stood by an arch of flowers, wearing a gray suit, his dark hair slightly tousled by the wind. He smiled when he saw Emily, and her heart warmed. She walked toward him, holding a bouquet to the soft melody of a guitar. Among the guests were her colleagues from Walker Studio, friends from New York, and her parents, Margaret and Richard, who sat in the front row. Emily saw their smiles, but she knew that this was her day, not theirs. The ceremony was short. Emily and Andrew exchanged vows, their words simple but heartfelt. "I promise to be with you, to support you, and to love you every day," Andrew said. Emily replied, "I choose you, today and always." They put on rings, and the guests applauded. Emily kissed Andrew, feeling at peace with herself and her decisions. After the ceremony, the reception began, refreshments, music, laughter. Emily danced with Andrew, then Sarah, then her father. Richard, leaning on his cane, said, "I'm proud of you, honey." Emily nodded, feeling warm. She had set boundaries with her parents a year ago, and their relationship had improved. Margaret, hugging her, whispered, "You're happy, and that's what matters." Emily smiled, knowing they had learned to respect her choices. Emily continued to grow Studio Walker. Her team grew to 10 people, working on projects for startups, schools, and charities. Emily found inspiration in helping others, especially in projects for animal shelters and children's centers. She remembered Daniel's kindness, how he supported her dreams and wanted to pass it on. She ran workshops to help young designers believe in themselves, and their successes filled her with pride. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Daniel Clark stood in his garden, decorated with fairy lights. Today, he and Laura were celebrating their 8th wedding anniversary. Their house was full of guests, friends, colleagues, their children Jake, now 10, Emma, 7, and Liam, 5. Max, the golden retriever, ran between the tables, stealing bits of food. Laura, in a blue dress, laughed as she passed out drinks. Daniel looked at her and felt grateful. His life was full, and he had found his happiness. Daniel raised his glass and said, "Thank you to everyone who's with us today. Laura, you make me a better person every day. Here's to our family." The guests applauded, and Laura kissed him. Jake ran up, hugging his father. "Dad, can I have some cake?" he asked. Daniel laughed. "Coming soon, champ." His company was thriving. He was mentoring hundreds of entrepreneurs, but his family remained his center. Daniel watched the children play with Max, and Laura talked to her friends. He remembered walking down the aisle 10 years ago, leaving Emily behind. It had hurt then, but it had brought him here. Meeting her at a conference a year ago had closed that chapter. He didn't think about her, but he wanted her to be happy. Emily returned to New York after the wedding. She and Andrew settled into a new apartment in Brooklyn, with a large window in the living room. Emily continued working in the studio, launching a project for a women's aid foundation. She felt that her work was changing the world, and it gave her meaning. Andrew supported her by helping with campaign copy. Their life was simple but full: dinners at home, walks, plans for the future. One evening, Emily sat at her desk, looking at her laptop. She opened a document and began writing a letter. "Daniel," she wrote, "I want to thank you. You taught me how to love, how to dream, how to be myself. I made mistakes, but they brought me here. I'm happy, and I hope you are too." Emily reread the text, feeling warmth. She knew she wouldn't send the letter. It was for her heart. She saved the document and closed her laptop, deciding to leave the past where it was. Emily thought about her life. She had let go of the guilt over Daniel, made peace with her parents, and found love with Andrew. Her studio was growing, her projects were helping people. She was at peace with herself, and that was her victory. Emily looked at her engagement ring, simple, silver, like the one Daniel had picked out for her. But now it symbolized her new life. In San Francisco, Daniel and Laura were cleaning up after a party. The kids were asleep. Max was lying by the fireplace. Laura hugged Daniel. "It was a good day," she said. "I love our life." Daniel nodded. "Me too." He looked at her, at the house, and knew he had found his happiness. His journey had been long, but it had led him here. He hadn't looked back, focusing on his family and his future. Emily and Andrew went for a walk in the park near their home. It was warm, the sun was setting, turning the sky orange. They walked hand in hand, talking about work, about their plans. Emily stopped at a bench, looking at the trees. She remembered the park in Westport where Daniel had proposed to her, but now it didn't hurt. She smiled, feeling light. Andrew put his arm around her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how happy I am," she replied. They sat on a bench, looking at the sky. Emily felt that her life was complete. Love, work, freedom. She was where she wanted to be. That evening, Daniel walked out into his yard. Jake and Emma were running around throwing a ball to Max. Liam was trying to catch up. Laura was sitting on the porch, laughing. Daniel joined the kids, throwing Emma into the air. She squealed with joy. Daniel looked at his family and smiled. He felt at peace, knowing that he had found the meaning of his life. Emily and Andrew returned home, still holding hands. She looked up at the sky, where the stars were beginning to appear. Her smile was genuine, full of hope. In San Francisco, Daniel looked up at the sky as he held Liam in his arms. His smile was one of gratitude. Two people whose paths had diverged 10 years earlier had found peace on different roads. Emily and Daniel were happy in their own ways, and their smiles toward the sky said one thing: life went on. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.